Okay, so we're talking a lot about header bidding and how it's really sort of changed the industry, as Michael said, as Tony mentioned. Well, what are SSPs and marketplaces and DSPs doing to excuse me differentiate themselves? Like, how are they going to change over time? And so Katie and I would like to talk about that a little bit. First, we're going to talk through the just basic marketplace context, who's participating and whatnot, and then we'll get into a little bit about what SSPs are doing, how their marketplaces are changing, and then the buy-side reaction to that. So let's say we have this theoretical marketplace. It's not something that you can see or touch. I use the word marketplace here, but we could also switch this out for exchange if we wanted to. And you guys know the players. You basically have, on the technology side, sell side and buy side components, and there's the SSP on the sell side and the DSP on the buy side. Obviously, we'll have, publishers and sellers and advertisers and buyers in here as well. But just talking about the technology, these are kind of the two interfaces into that marketplace. So on the SSP side, the goal of the SSP is really to allow the publisher to connect into the marketplace, to auction off all their supply or monetize their supply, and then ultimately the goal is to make the publisher as much money as possible, right? On the DSP side, they're trying to figure out what's the right supply to give the buyer. How do you optimize the media budget, and ultimately, how do you hit some sort of performance goals? Pretty standard stuff. So on the SSP side, I'm going to talk a little bit about what SSPs have done to sort of differentiate themselves in the past, and also sort of what they're doing now, and then what they're likely to do. Some of these things you guys are probably pretty familiar with. The point of this is to try and give as much context as to why companies may be making some of these decisions and what you're likely to see. So this is not an exhaustive list. This is just trying to be a little bit educational. So on the SSP side, sort of start with the basics, right? So every SSP in the world has to do some sort of basic level of safety around the creatives that come through their platform, or at least they should be. The policies that they enforce, do they handle legal policies, for example, legal compliance? They need to be able to handle an auction or run some sort of demand motion to actually give the publisher money. And then finally, handle reporting and payments and things like that. So these are the basics. Everything, every SSP has this, and this bar is sort of rising over time too, as publishers have more and more expectations. The next thing, as Michael mentioned and talked about sort of the waterfall, before header bidding, if you had an SSP that had preferential waterfall access, or you had an exchange or a marketplace that was tied into the dominant ad server that's out there, you had marketplaces that were really sort of entrenched, and new marketplaces had trouble growing, right? If buyers could only access the preferred supply in one marketplace, other marketplaces would never be able to grow. So header bidding solved some of that problem. That's the problem I'm saying is before. And then the problem that we have today, or the problem that marketplaces will have as they try and grow, is this sort of like bias problem. So either the wrapper having some sort of logic in it or shenanigans to not send bids correctly or preference one partner over another. That's sort of some of the things that Danny talked about, and sort of the pre-bid is trying to make sure doesn't happen. And then ad server setups. So we see a lot of publishers where they'll work with one vendor and set up price buckets in one way, and they'll work with another vendor and set up price buckets in another way. And if those price buckets don't align, you can sometimes get some unintentional bias in the ad server. So for example, one partner sets up a price bucket at 10 cents, another partner sets up a price bucket at 11 cents. If they both bid 12 cents, the 11-cent price bucket will have an advantage over the 10-cent price bucket as they get rounded down. So that's really important for publishers to watch out for, and we have a number of articles and topics and trainings on how to spot these biases and make sure you set up header bidding to avoid them, feel free to come chat with me after. Happy to walk through that. So, we have our basics done. We have our equal access and equal competition. You're going to see marketplaces more and more start to differentiate themselves on policies and commercial things. So, for example, making a stand like AppNexus did that we weren't going to tolerate, hate speech, and that wasn't going to be allowed on our platform. Like, we're putting a stake in the ground there to try and establish a marketplace policy and a standard and a framing for how buyers think about our marketplace, so that buyers like to work with our marketplace, therefore we can give publishers more money. Other things here will be, around transparency, around rates, payment terms, policies around refresh rates and such. A lot of innovation, I think, is going to happen here in the next year or two. And then I have marketing here. It's just marketing, positioning. Some marketplaces may try and be more performance focused or more branding focused. Be pretty interesting to see how that plays out. And then finally, you'll have folks that try to foster, allow the publisher to bring their relationships into the marketplace to allow it to expand, allow them to create better relationships with buyers. But I think this is really about new transaction types too. So allowing people to transact on views, for example, is a great example of this, of a marketplace expanding, offering more value to the publisher and therefore more value to the seller as well. And that helps the marketplace grow and differentiate from marketplaces that can't do that. So we talked about these 4 things. Again, these are not, an all-inclusive list, but I think it really comes back to, setting the basics, the equal access that we talked about, which has been really, really solved by header bidding, policy and commercial, and then finally the transaction types and allowing people to bring in their relationships. So that's the sell side of how SSPs are changing and trying to differentiate one another. Katie's going to talk a little bit about the buy side.
Great, thanks, Mike. Great, so I'm going to be talking about the lens of the DSP. What are DSPs thinking about given the incredible acceleration and pace of change in the programmatic landscape? So obviously DSPs are looking to optimize outcomes for their buyers, and so it's been really challenging given the fact that access to supply has changed so rapidly. So let's take a look at the supply landscape and the route that an impression takes to ultimately reach the DSP. So reading this slide from left to right, we have a single impression being loaded on a web page, which is then sent to 7 header bidding partners. This is supply proliferation point 1. That single impression at this juncture becomes 7 separate impressions. Those header bidding partners are all going to be integrated with their own series of networks and exchanges, and there's additional proliferation points along the way. So ultimately, by the time that single impression reaches the DSP, the impression has proliferated and multiplied into, in this example, 10, but oftentimes it could potentially be hundreds, you never know. So the DSP is faced with, a real challenge here. How are they supposed to make sense of all of these different available routes to purchase the same exact thing, knowing that every path to purchase is not going to be created equal? So, DSPs today are really investing a lot of time and energy in thinking about how they optimize different paths to purchase. The AppNexus approach to managing this is a product called Supply Path Optimization. So it's pretty literal, but it's otherwise known as SPO. And that's going to seek to find that best path to purchase a single impression on behalf of buyers. So let's talk about how this works. SPO is an algorithm that's going to take different clusters of inventory identified by domain, geo, supply type, and media type, and then look at volumes and performance aligned to that cluster of inventory. So we'll look at volume of impression requests. Volume of impression requests is going to allow us to gauge who has equal access to this inventory. Do we have full access through a certain partner or through a certain path? Then we'll start to look at CPMs. By analyzing CPMs and the variance across CPMs, across different supply paths, we can start to understand the flooring and different dynamics that are underlying each path to purchasing this impression. And then finally, we're going to look at win rate. Win rate gets really interesting because we can start to see where there might be, undisclosed or hidden fees that are diminishing our buyers' ability to get an optimal outcome. So when you apply SPO to the old supply chain, or the commoditized supply chain, you'll find one best available path to purchase. Then we will start to optimize away from those other paths to purchase that don't yield those optimal outcomes for our buyers. Next is inventory quality. So DSPs are also thinking a lot, DSPs and marketplaces actually are talking a lot about inventory quality. So who here remembers MethBot? It was about a year ago. Not everyone. So MethBot was a really sophisticated botnet that got a lot of press last December, and it siphoned hundreds of $millions away from programmatic advertisers. It was on the front page of the New York Times, I think. My mom saw it, at least. And so, it was a really big deal. And even since then, about every month, there's been a very steady drumbeat of press, calling into question whether advertisers can and should trust programmatic advertising. So it's safe to say that programmatic marketplaces and DSPs have a trust problem with our end clients, and we really are working to fix that. So what does inventory quality mean for AppNexus? It really means two core things. First is that our buyers buy real audiences. So I think we make a ton of investments in our algorithmic fraud detection systems. We have over 30 algorithms that scan every single impression that come into our system and look for those fraud signatures and shut down inventory that's deemed to be misrepresented or audiences that are deemed to be misrepresented. I think a really great proof point for our success in this area is our MethBot exposure. So while many other marketplaces and DSPs were impacted to the tune of millions of dollars, AppNexus's exposure to MethBot was under 500. So, really, really strong in this inventory quality area. Next is real inventory. This is making investments on an ongoing basis in things like domain detection. So buyers, are serving on the domains they intend to, and what they target is what they ultimately get. The next core, DSP area of interest is the validated supply chain. So this is where things like ads.txt comes in. So obviously, a buyer wants to be sure that when they purchase a domain, the end publisher is ultimately paid. So having that validated, traceable supply chain is really important to making them successful there. So AppNexus has stood behind ads.txt since it was first initiated about 6 months ago. And we are going to be furthering our investment in joining forces with other DSPs in the area and only buying ads.txt compliant supply beginning in January. So, for the love of God, publishers in this room, please update your ads.txt files. Make sure your AppNexus member is listed accurately. AppNexus is spelled correctly. We have a tool to help you. It's called the ads.txt validator. So yeah, really excited for, taking that next really important step in validating the supply chain on behalf of our buyers. And then finally, DSPs are thinking about cost management. We've talked a lot about infrastructure costs belonging to header bidding over the course of this morning, and DSPs are also included in this conversation. The AppNexus DSP saw impression volumes double over the course of about 4 months last year. It was really pretty impressive, but that comes with obviously a huge COGS implication. So what DSPs are thinking about is, how do I manage this from an infrastructure perspective? And so AppNexus has made a lot of investments in our impression routing and kind of filtering technology. So our approach is that we really want to listen to every impression that's out there. Buyers, buying habits change. We, don't want to blindly cut off any supply that could be monetized on your behalf. So instead, what we do is we'll listen to everything, gauge an impression's likelihood of being bid on, and then make a decision as to whether to hold an auction or not for that particular impression. And it's very dynamic. So again, as buyers' needs evolve, as their campaigns evolve, so does our gating strategy. Great. So in summary, 4 core areas about how DSPs are reacting to this changing supply landscape. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but 4 key areas: supply path optimization, investments in inventory quality, investments in the authorized supply chain and only paying or purchasing impressions through authorized sources, and then finally, infrastructure costs and COGS management. So wrapping things up, ultimately, our goal for the people in this room is we want to be your best monetization partner. And we're going to achieve that together over the course of the next year through ongoing investment in leading technology. That means, sell-side tech investments in sell-side technology like ad server and YieldX, wrapper, so on and so forth. But then also making really big investments in our buy-side technology. We just launched our AppNexus programmable platform. And through these investments, we hope to bring more money into our marketplace, which will then fuel better outcomes for you. So in this, two-sided marketplace, we hope everyone wins. And so, in summary, covering all the things that we talked about today, we covered, sell-side basics, how the sell side is innovating, and then on the back of that innovation, how the buy side is then responding. So certainly not nearly enough to cover in a short session. We're going to be going deeper on some of these topics later on in the breakouts, or I'd be happy to talk to any of you at the happy hour later. But thank you for your attention, and looking forward to the rest of the day.